Greetings everyone, and welcome to my continued series on Canada in the 20th century. This one effectively is the last lecture of my series dealing with Canada in the 20th century. And one of the complicated things I think with doing a series in any way, shape, or form is the idea that you have so many different layers of narrative. You have the political, you have the social, you have the global, and when we're looking at any country, in our case Canada, things fork out in all kinds of directions, and for someone like myself who tends to be a very linear, sequential thinker, at least certainly as I teach history, the linear sequential format for me is the most logical, as opposed to a more thematic approach, which is what the current BC high school curriculum demands or asks for. So we tend to kind of go in all kinds of directions. I've got about 4 or 5 lectures that deal with Canada from 1945 to 2000. Some deal with Canada in Canada's relationship with the world. Some deal with Canada at home. Some deal with Canada and relationships with Quebec, and so on and so forth. So there's a lot of different ways. In some ways it can be very complicated to teach in a straight linear sequential format, even though that is the way that I prefer to teach history. Sometimes you've got to do things a little bit thematic as well. So this lecture will end with more or less the creation of Nunavut as a new territory in Canada in 1999. The core of this lecture is going to look at multiculturalism, of course, as you can see, and also the majority of this lecture is going to deal with Canada's relationship with First Nations, which we will address in great detail as well. When I think of multiculturalism, I think of lots of different people from lots of different places coming together, sharing ideas, sharing cultural traits, sharing food, and that's one of the great benefits of multiculturalism, amongst many other things, is our access to a wide variety of foods and restaurants. In many ways, though, I think multiculturalism makes us better people, because the more we understand about other cultures, the less we are to fear them, the less we are to feel that sense of the other. I've had the great privilege of living and growing up in a place where there's a very robust Chinese Canadian community, a very robust South Asian community, and many, many other groups as well. So I sort of grew up in a climate where I never really questioned the fact that there were people, students in my classes who were from different cultures. I was always fascinated with it and curious about it as well. So I think having grown up in that kind of environment certainly taught me tolerance, taught me understanding, taught me compassion, taught me curiosity, and all these things. And that's why, as I do this lecture right now, we are in the throes of very, very violent clashes and protests in the United States over the George Floyd murder in Minneapolis. And when I look across the border and see what's happening down there, I should note, though, the majority of the protests are peaceful, but certainly there have been significant outbursts of violence in this process. When I look across the border, I marvel at the idea, and I shake my head in the sense that I naively thought that after the period of the civil rights movement, which really gained momentum in the 1960s, that we'd sort of come to a place where, while you're never going to eliminate racism, it was pushed to the margins, that it was not commonplace. Racism was not commonplace. It was now something pushed to the side. And even as a history teacher, I'd always taught that idea that, yes, there will always be, these groups that are hostile to minorities or hostile to African Americans or hostile to whoever. but they're somewhere out there on the internet, in remote communities, so on and so forth. Well, what I've learned, of course, with these movements is that is not the case, and that we are confronting racism head on. And, you know, throughout the world, we are recognizing that racism is unfortunately everywhere. And, you know, we have to continue to try to move forward and find ways of accepting people, understanding people, because there's so much to gain, as far as I understand it, by understanding other cultures, having compassion, having curiosity, willingness to accept diversity, all these things. I know they sound like cliches, but I really do feel that way, and certainly as a teacher and an educator, it is my moral responsibility, I think, to share those kinds of values. So when we talk about multiculturalism in Canada, we are talking about this great experiment. And really, if you think about it, only Canada and the United States, although I guess you could argue perhaps Australia as well, were places where you saw hundreds of thousands of people come from all four corners of the globe into one new country and form what would become Canada. Canada is a collection of peoples, not only First Peoples, of course, or British or French, but Ukrainians and Poles and African Canadians and South Asians and the Chinese community and so on and so on and so on. It really was a truly grand experiment. The multicultural policy that begins to develop by the late 1960s, early 70s, was a recognition that this is where Canada was at, and that this should become, as a result, formal policy. So anyway, let's move on. From World War I until the 1960s, Canada had a fairly restricted immigration policy, preferring British and Northern Europeans. So, you know, and we've talked about this if you've looked at my lectures from the 20s and 30s, the very restrictive policies we had towards people of color, very restrictive policies in even the way people were treated of color who were in Canada, whether they be Chinese railway workers or South Asian immigrants who were, of course, turned away in 1914 in the Komagata Maru incident, amongst many others, that, you know, whether we like to admit it or not, racism had been a very big part of our sort of past, of Canada's history as well. So it would be naive to think that racism was something that was over there. It was unfortunately right here. In 1962, new regulations removed limits on African, Asian, and other peoples of color. By 1967, legislation made policy officially colorblind, and education and skills became primary requirements. So if you wanted to move to Canada after 1967, the official policy was, we will welcome people in, but it will be dependent on what they have to offer if they come to Canada. So, for example, of course there were refugees, people fleeing war and violent situations, but there are also people who just wanted to move to Canada for opportunity. So if you came and you were a trained engineer or something, or you had certain skills, or you met certain requirements of the Canadian government, then you would be welcomed in. So that was the hope and that was the thought. In 1971, Trudeau introduced multiculturalism, encouraging different ethnic groups to express their cultures. So multiculturalism basically says that when we bring people in from other parts of the world to our country, you are Canadian, we want you to be Canadian, but we don't want you to shy away from celebrating the culture that you came from. So this is not to say that we're discouraging people from learning English or French or becoming in tune and connected with Canadian culture, but don't be afraid to hold on to what you're leaving, because that is a big part of who you are, and there's no shame in that. So, community folk festivals and multicultural activities were organized across the country. This was very common. Even where I live, every year we had something called Folk Fest, where you would go down and there would be these little huts all over the place serving all kinds of ethnic foods, and there'd be ethnic dance, and cultural activities and things like that. Folk Fest was always kind of a fun place to go, and to meet all kinds of interesting people as well. So 1976, policies allowed immigration of family members with relatives already in Canada, especially those fleeing persecution in war zones. So if you had a family member in Canada, that was a huge asset in terms of getting you through the door and hopefully remaining and staying in Canada indefinitely. By the 1980s, most were Asian, and they were predominantly entering the larger cities like Vancouver and Toronto. Vancouver has a very rich Vietnamese community as well, and many of those people came over after the end of the Vietnam War, who were fleeing what they thought was going to be a tyrannical rule by the head Communist Party, who would take control in Saigon in 1975. Later they would change the name of Saigon to Ho Chi Minh City. So there's also a very rich South Asian and Chinese community. Vancouver and British Columbia in general, I would say mostly Vancouver and Victoria, have very, very rich Asian cultures in our areas, and a lot of people also went to Toronto as well. So, multiculturalism, what are the benefits and what are the concerns? Now when I say pros and cons, I'm not saying cons in a negative way, but it's more about what challenges do we face when we recognize and include so many different people, because not only are we dealing with different languages, we're dealing with different cultural rules, if you will, or we're also dealing with different religions as well. So there's a lot of layers to the onion of bringing all these people together and asking them to be part of this family of Canadians, but allowing them to and encouraging them to hold on to their ethnic roots, but also becoming Canadian. So in '88, the federal government established the Department of Multiculturalism and Citizenship to promote multiculturalism in all areas of government policy. Most believe the policy was constructive by promoting a welcome atmosphere of tolerance which encouraged national unity and mutual respect. Right? That's the thinking. Some believe that multiculturalism prevented a common identity by encouraging groups to maintain their own identity. Okay, it's not an unreasonable claim. So the concern was, well, what happens if people come and they choose not to learn the language, or they maintain their original language and they don't integrate within the greater family of the Canadian nation? Certainly there are going to be pockets of communities. I mean, if you have somebody coming to Canada with their family from, let's say, Calcutta, and grandma's 75 years old, it's not unreasonable to think that she may not be in a position to start to learn a new language. That may not be something that she's keen to do at her age, for what however, the young people and children that are born from those families in Canada will be raised speaking English, and probably their family language as well. A lot of the students that I have who are either South Asian or Chinese, many of them are bilingual because they've been raised to learn English not only in the home and school, but they've also been taught their mother tongue at home as well. And being bilingual is a huge advantage in many ways. So some preferred the U.S. melting pot model of assimilation, giving up identities to some degree and taking on the mainstream culture to a greater extent. So the melting pot and multiculturalism are really pretty much the same kind of thing. What the American melting pot says is that everyone's got to compromise a little by taking on more of the characteristic of American culture. And we're not encouraging you to forget your Chinese heritage or your Italian heritage or your South Asian heritage, but we want to strongly encourage you to learn American history, learn American culture, learn English, Spanish maybe too as well. So the melting pot is more sort of an acculturation, if you will, of these groups, where multiculturalism is more, yes, we want you to learn English and integrate in our community, but we also want you to hold on to your traditional values, because we wouldn't think of asking you to leave all that behind. Right? So Melting pot, multiculturalism, quite close. In BC, traditional holidays like Easter and Christmas based on Christian faith posed a challenge for schools with larger ethnic groups. It's an interesting thing, you know, and this is still a topic of hot debate. And I remember, I've got 3 children. My oldest is 28 now, and when she was in elementary school in the late 90s, I remember there was quite a strong movement, for example, towards no longer referring to the Christmas break as Christmas break. It was now the winter holidays. Christmas trees that may have adorned the hallways in your elementary school before that were kind of taken away and kind of put to the side, and that the focus was on a winter holiday. And the symbology of Christmas were kind of pushed to the side. Very quickly though, within a couple of years, by the early 2000s, there's a bit of a pushback saying, wait a second here, I don't think that new immigrants who come to Canada are going to be offended by Christmas symbology, you know. And there were many people who would say, well, you know what, they've come here on their own accord, they want to be Canadian, they want to be part of this. Certainly they're not going to have any problems enjoying the concept of Christmas, of giving and sharing and being with family. Essentially, that's what we want Christmas to be. And now it's sort of ebbed and flowed a bit. You know, people use the term Christmas break now when we talk about it. And, you know, for friends of mine who come from other parts of the world, or whose parents came from other parts of the world, have said to me very quite frankly, they love Christmas. Christmas to them is just as special to them as anybody else. Maybe not the religious end of it, but they can still celebrate the idea of Christmas. They love the trees, they love the hymns and the songs, and being with family and eating turkey and doing all that kind of stuff. So you can still enjoy the major premise of Christmas without necessarily adhering to sort of the more Christian elements of it and all that kind of thing. So it's an interesting idea that you know, that there was this movement to say, well, we need to remove that so that, you know, Jews or Muslims or Buddhists and others are not offended. But I honestly don't think people, for the most part, were offended. They knew when they came to Canada that was the predominant culture and background of Canada. And in saying that now, there's been a lot more celebration of other religious holidays as well. And I think that's almost a better approach. Instead of taking away Christian symbology, incorporate more of the Jewish holiday, you know, or Ramadan and other things like that. So I think that makes that to me represents more of a multicultural framework than taking something away. So anyway, most schools opted to focus on multicultural holidays instead of removing traditional Canadian holidays. And that's basically what I was just saying there. So, okay, so for multiculturalism, here we are talking about diversity, welcoming people, and throughout the course of this period, in the 60s and 70s, we have our Indigenous peoples, First Nations, is a term we use in Canada, who are still living very, very much in the margin. And what a tragic irony that here the original Canadians, if you will, who are really reeling and had been reeling for generations as a result of the impact of the residential schools. It's very interesting for me because when I attended elementary school, while I was exposed to Chinese students and South Asian students and Eastern European students, I don't recall ever having one First Nations child in my school from kindergarten to grade 7. In fact, it wasn't until I attended high school that I went to school with my first First Nation students. And it's an ironic thing if you think about it. And you know, obviously that was a result of the fact that many of the First Peoples communities were still living firmly entrenched on reserves. Children were still going to residential schools, although by the 70s and 80s they become a little less harsh than they were certainly in the earlier period, but that doesn't negate the fact that the residential school phenomenon has had a dramatic cultural consequence on the healing of the Aboriginal people. We'll talk more about that a little later because it's such an important topic. But all right, so when First Nations obtained the vote in 1960s, it did little to improve their living conditions. Those that tried their luck in urban areas faced discrimination and hostility. This is one of the great tragic ironies, is that when young people wanted to escape sort of the drudgery of if you'll call it that, of a remote reserve community. They wanted to see the world expand a bit. Whenever they went into the cities, they were treated with brutal discrimination, and certainly they were not getting hired for certain jobs. They were being treated poorly, and a lot of them were like, well, I'm just going to go back to the reserve. So, you know, there was a sort of insular tendency, which was really encouraged by the lack of acceptance that they received from the broader Canadian mainstream. In the growing activism of the late 1960s, Trudeau proposed a white paper in 1969 which called for an end to the protective attitude of government policy, and First Nations should be treated exactly as other citizens. Now, this was obviously intended to encourage some kind of equity in how government viewed not only First Nations but all Canadians. And it was, I'd say, for the most part well-intentioned, but there was just literally generations of horrible treatment. And a simple white paper was not going to suddenly make everything better. In fact, it really isn't until the 21st century when we implement the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which really brings to the fore all the emotional heartbreak of the realities of the residential school phenomenon. And I keep referring to that because that is really the core of what created such a difficult time for a lot of Aboriginal people and families. So, the government believed that more assimilation with the mainstream would solve their problems. This made many First Nations groups furious to say, so you're going to ostracize us, you're going to put us on reserves, you're going to put us in these dreadful residential schools, and then all of a sudden you're going to say, but the more you're like us, the better off you'll be. Very, very much harking back to the age of colonialism, you know, and in many ways the residential school phenomenon was a legacy of colonialism. And without getting too much into this, let me give you a quick example. When Britain, France, Belgium, Germany, and others began to travel overseas to control nations of Africa and Asia, you know, they did it because they wanted cheap labor, they wanted cheap resources, and they could convince their public that, hey, we're traveling overseas to bring civilization to four corners of the globe, and we're going to Christianize them as well, because the more they're like us, the better off they will be. This is kind of an extension of that notion that, you know, after everything they'd been through, to make that suggestion was pretty ignorant in many ways. So First Nations would present their red paper, which outlined self-government, and Jean Chrétien, the Indian Affairs Minister at the time, decided to shelve the white paper, but offered no new policy in its place. So the white paper concept was quickly sort of shuttled to the margin once it was realized that maybe not a lot of forethought had gone into this declaration. First Nations saw education as primary, especially on the heels of the cultural impact of the residential schools, which were for the most part abandoned by 1969, but they continued through the 70s and 80s. I think the last residential school was closed in 1996. So, for the first peoples to take control of their education system, their own education was absolutely paramount. Now, I want to clarify something about the residential schools, because we've talked about this in great length in other lectures in other areas. But when a child is taken from their home, 6, 7 years old, and their parents have no say in it, and they're put in a school in a remote community with people they don't know, maybe with people who are very kindly, but also maybe people who are very cold and brutal. That is traumatizing for any child. you know. And then to be forced into these schools where physical and sexual abuse was rampant in many of these, the brutal trauma that that child internalizes is just unimaginable. When that phenomenon happens from one generation to the next, so if grandmother was in residential school, mom was, and the kids were, this is a generational trauma. That is why we talk about residential schools so much, because it's not just something that can be turned off, forgotten about, and tucked away. This is something that needs to be acknowledged, that needs to be recognized. We, as Canadians, need to ensure to our First Peoples that we do now understand, we do appreciate, and now the Canadian government has apologized, and now our school curriculums are dedicated to much learning about Aboriginal people's history and so on and so forth. That the great reckoning that came out of Truth and Reconciliation was an attempt to give First Peoples the opportunity to heal after years and years and years of suppressed psychological and mental torment, which is really, there's no other way to describe this. I mean, the residential school phenomenon was genocidal. I know that's a strong word because the connotations that word has is very, very strong. But what I mean by that is that it was an attempt to strip people of their indigenous culture, tell them that what they believed in, what they spoke, what they ate, what they did was unworthy, and that they were to adapt British or French cultural ideas, which were the right way. So, once you have that kind of thing pumped through your veins, I mean, that's very, very difficult and traumatizing for these people and for their culture. So, band schools emerged in various parts of the country focusing on language, culture, traditions, but a lack of secondary schools near the reserves caused problems, requiring high school kids to leave home and attend schools in urban centers, leading to loneliness and isolation again. As First Peoples began to take control over their primary and elementary education, which we were transitioning towards, a lot of the kids would then have to attend high schools close by. And once again, they're having to leave home in many cases. So, we needed to kind of keep moving forward. And now, of course, there are many, many Aboriginal schools that have K through 12, or that have schools that are close to each other as well, too. So, although the residential schools have been dismantled, its legacy continues to haunt many who live through it. And of course, we've talked about that as well. Stories of abuse and mistreatment led in 1998 to the federal government apologizing for its role in the problem, and they announced a $350 million healing fund. I don't know. I'm a bit conflicted the idea of just throwing money at a problem, but I guess it was an attempt to bring some comfort. I guess if it could alleviate poverty, if it could give people a second chance in getting some type of training or whatever, then that is a good thing. But part of the problem that the First Peoples have had with the Canadian government was this sort of learned helplessness. The Canadian government kept just enabling their helplessness by not training them or not giving them skills, but just throwing money at them to kind of be out of sight, out of mind. And that's the real tragedy that became the residential school phenomenon, and also the reserve system as well. All right, well, the expansion of Canadian industries of hydroelectricity and natural gas drew concerns from First Peoples that their traditional activities of hunting, fishing, and trapping were being threatened. So what's happening now is that the development of hydroelectricity, the development of oil industries, holy mackerel, that's a huge can of worms there, was beginning to have an impact on the environment, which in effect was having an impact on First Peoples' traditional ways of life. So, in the 1970s, Inuit, Métis, and Dene groups in the north opposed a pipeline through the Mackenzie Valley, and they demanded a study to determine the impact of their lands. The federal government agreed. The Berger Commission conducted hearings all over the north, listening carefully to First Nations concerns. The Commission recommended a 10-year hold on development to allow for thoughtful study, but it was not until the year 2000 that First Nations became open to the idea. So, First Nations wanted control and some ownership of the project. And in Quebec, after a long dispute in the 80s and 90s, Cree residents of the north managed to halt construction of a James Bay hydro project which threatened flooding of ancestral territory. So, this is why this issue of pipelines, which is a huge part of, the 21st century, these problems begin sort of to develop in the late 1990s, or mid-late 1990s. In 1980, the Assembly of First Nations was formed to represent them in their dealings with the federal government. So you got all these First Nations groups coming together to try to reach some kind of consensus so that they could make proposals to the federal government sort of as a block, because I think the more that you have a part of your defense, if you will, the stronger the argument you could make. Leaders pressured for First Nations rights, which would be entrenched in the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. The increase in band council powers begged the question, what other powers should be transferred from the federal government to band councils? The more control that First Peoples could have over their own lands and destiny naturally encouraged them to want to be more in control. Maybe have your own school system, have your own policing system, these kinds of things. So taking a significant amount of control of their own destiny. Self-government would give them rights to manage their own resources, education, culture, and justice systems. So specific claims arose in areas where treaties between First Nations and the federal government had been signed, but their terms not kept. And the Great Reckoning, if I can use that term for this, was the idea that all those treaties that were signed in the 19th century, where so many groups, so many First Nations tribes signed things they didn't understand. I mean, we could talk about the Douglas treaties here on Vancouver Island, and the list goes on and on and on across this country, where, many First Peoples believe they've been completely hoodwinked. And when you look at the documents and you read these treaties, it's pretty clear that in many cases they were definitely taken advantage of. Comprehensive claims question the ownership of land in large parts of Canada that were never surrendered by treaty, right? And inevitably, as we transition towards a more empowered First Peoples, people who were now really interested in self-government, interested in taking control of their own destiny through their territorial lands, you're going to have conflict. Land claims occurred largely behind the scenes, but in the summer of 1990, in a small Quebec town called Oka, events made headlines across Canada. When the Oka Town Council decided to expand a golf course into land disputed because the Mohawk considered it sacred, the First Nations there decided to block roads to prevent development. The mayor of Oka called on provincial police to remove the blockade on July 11th. Gunfire broke out, leading to the death of an officer. And, you had images like this, toe-to-toe, nose-to-nose stare-downs. Both sides set up blockades and violent confrontations occurred between Quebec communities, police, and Mohawks. Federal troops were called in, and under pressure from other bands, the Mohawks of Kanesatake ended the blockade. Sorry, my pronunciation sounded more Japanese than Mohawk, but what is that, a T? Yeah, Kanesatake. The federal government would purchase the land and then give it to the Mohawks. Interesting decision. So, and this kind of thing, was inevitable as we transition towards, because, there are going to be people who've lived on these ancestral lands who are not First Peoples, some for generations. So what is that going to mean for them? Are they going to be kicked off? Are they going to be expected to abide by local Aboriginal law and so on and so forth? So it was very complex. Now, land claims across the country were occurring. In BC, it was very, very significant. There was a huge amount of change. The vast and remote character of BC, in addition to being a late addition to the British Empire, meant that many areas were never officially claimed. As early as 1887, the Nisga'a people of the Nass Valley asserted their land rights, and in 1912 became the first to lay a claim against the Canadian government, way back in 1912. In 1993, the Nisga'a won a partial victory when the Supreme Court agreed they were entitled to land. In 1996, they were offered a settlement that gave them 8% of their original claim land, ownership of forests, and partial profits from salmon fisheries and hydro development. They also won the right to develop their own municipal government and policing, and they received $190 million over 15 years in compensation for lost land. And they agreed to be taxpayers, giving up their tax-exempt status under the Indian Act. Okay, so they wanted to pay their share. They wanted to be completely equal and, in the eyes of the law, completely legitimate. The creation of Nunavut in 1999 resulted from the largest treaty ever negotiated in Canada, giving the Inuit control of 1.6 million square kilometers on the eastern Arctic. And of course, Iqaluit on Baffin Island would become the new capital of Nunavut. Some say Nunavut. I've heard both pronunciations used. So BC was really moving forward. And of course, since the end of the 20th century, there has been, in the last 20 some odd years, a continued change, and there's been continued concern about pipeline questions, whether it be Keystone or others. So the issues of Aboriginal self-government, of treaty rights, continues to this day, but it really begins to gain momentum in the 80s and 90s. So, all right, that being said, we're going to leave it at that. So this kind of more or less concludes our look at Canada in the 20th century, and I hope you've had a chance to look at them, and don't hesitate to ask me any questions through my YouTube channel. You're welcome to pose any appropriate questions there, and then I'd be happy to answer them right away. So anyway, thank you again, and we'll see you again.